Hello and welcome to episode 31 of MMO Weekly, presented as always by MetsmerizedOnline.com. I'm your host, Sal Manzo, along with my co-host and executive editor, Mike Mayer. And in this 3-week long Carlos Correa saga, in the end, Carlos Correa signs with his third team, the Minnesota Twins. Pending physical has never been more triggering for a fan base ever. And Mike, I just want to get your thoughts on how the heck we ended up here.
Well, I think that's what we're going to spend most of our time talking about tonight. But yeah, I mean, Carlos Correa said his heart was always in Minnesota earlier today. And I guess with all the issues that have kind of come up with the ankle and just how teams are going to work out deals, I guess if it wasn't going to be the Mets, that's one thing I kind of said, and a lot of people other said, is we mentioned the Twins. I mean, it just made so much sense because, I mean, that's where it was with last year.
Right.
They have, I mean, they have some knowledge of his previous injury issues. They've gone over the physicals with him. They've gone over the medical records. So, I mean, we all felt there was a good chance that the Mets were going to finalize this deal. I mean, I know at some point the Mets were very confident in it too, but if it didn't go through, I mean, certainly with two deals dead, the Twins were really the only team that made much sense given their relationship with Correa. And I mean, you could see that in the press conference today. I mean, the Twins organization is very comfortable with him and he's very comfortable with the Twins organization. So that's, I mean, when it fell apart with the Giants, Boris knew immediately he had the Mets to fall back to. And when things started not to go their way with the Mets, he always knew in the back of his head that he had the Twins to fall back to, that they certainly had interest in bringing Correa back. And that's somehow where we ended up in this. I mean, going back to the Giants starting this, we're going on over a month that this whole process has kind of ended up to where he was officially announced as a Minnesota Twin on January 11th, 2023.
Yeah, and I mean, if you go through the three contracts, I think Correa got a combined $800-something million for like 20-something years. So, if you put everything together, I guess he did a good job. But, I've been thinking, mulling it over the last day or so, and I'm under the camp of the Mets really wanted him. Steve Cohen really wanted him. He put that out there when the deal was first announced 3 weeks ago with the Mets. So to me, there must be something such a red flag with the ankle, whatever it was, for the Mets to not ultimately get this deal done. It just tells me that they saw something that really, scared them and pushed them away. And not for nothing, someone like Steve Cohen. Now, again, it's going to be growing pains because he's going to learn to never open his mouth until deals are officially official now. He's learning as an owner as well. But you don't get $14 billion by just being willy-nilly with everything. Clearly, it's a player that they wanted, but ultimately he trusted his baseball people, their medical staff, and their evaluations. And it hurts right now in the short term because it came right from the owner's mouth, right? They feel like they're a bat short. Correa would have put them over the edge. But again, after doing their due diligence, they found that this is not an investment for what they originally offered. Is good for the player. They offered something else. And it came out that obviously it was wound up being a 6-year, $165 million deal with the next 6 years, all options with physicals after the end of every season to get him to that 12th year of the original contract. Is it strange? Yes. I've never heard, pending physical and all this so much before in my life with a free agent. But I have to give the Mets credit that they stood their ground and said, listen, we want this player, but we don't want to give a commitment where this player could ultimately not be on the field for most of the time of this deal. And I understand that. I also understand people are upset who wanted Correa, that they were a bat away and the deal was ultimately done. And, if it's a matter of money and, Cohen's the big bear on the block now spending all this money, I can understand why people are upset, but I think ultimately it's going to help the Mets long-term. As far as from a financial standpoint now, you can look to pivot to extend Alonso McNeil. I've seen that out there, which I think is a good idea. We've talked on the show about how they should get extended regardless. So this may open that up. Who knows what it means for next year with the free agent class? I know there was stuff that came out that the Mets, discussed at the end how Machado is going to opt out of his deal at the end of this year. I don't think that's something you could bank on. And especially it's a win now team. You shouldn't be banking on someone for next year. But I think the long-term, viability, I think they'll be okay. They'll be able to spend more in the years ahead, but it stings. That was a guy that you wanted. But now they have to pivot. They had a great offseason. This would have been a nice cherry, but there's still some pieces out there, not, the splash of a Carlos Correa, but a couple of guys you can maybe bring in to now fill this roster out now and do some things. But, I was shocked when I woke up that morning to see the notification about how the Mets swooped in, and I was equally as shocked yesterday when the whole thing happened with the Twins. But I don't know about you. I'm just kind of relieved in general that it's over one way or the other. It was just kind of dragging on forever, and I'm just happy it kind of came to a conclusion. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly happy that it came to a conclusion at this point. Obviously, Mets fans would have liked it to have been with the Mets. I think there's a lot of different discussion points on this.
Sure.
And we've seen a lot of them from Mets fans. I think it's kind of been a pretty even of, a group of, this really sucks. They should have got this done. And then on the other side, talking about, the Mets must have found something, this is a good thing by the Mets not making this long term. But I think there's some key points to either of those talking issues is that Steve Cohen said that the Mets needed a piece.
Mm-hmm.
And Carlos Correa was that piece. I mean, that's the owner of your team saying that the Mets need that piece. And we're certainly going to discuss what they could move on to later.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality of it is on the free agent market, there's nothing you can do.
Right.
You can piecemeal a couple of things. Andrew McCutchen, Adam Duvall,
mm-hmm.
Drickson, Profar. I mean, none of those get you even remotely close to Correa's output potential, any of that. Trade market, Bryan Reynolds, Shohei Ohtani. I mean, the likelihood of the sky is what both those teams are asking for those guys.
Right.
So the likelihood of either of those getting done don't sound very reasonable right now.
Right.
So you have to realize that Cohen said they needed him. Now they don't have him. And now there's not really a backup plan. Maybe there's a trade piece that a name we haven't heard yet. Maybe that comes out. That's possible. But I think you also have to realize while trying to, I don't want to say side with Cohen and the Mets, but kind of understand where they're coming from. But you also have to realize that the Twins are comfortable giving him $200 million. And this is a team that can't risk money.
Right.
They don't have the ability to risk money like Cohen does. And that's kind of where I fall back onto is Cohen has already spent this much money this offseason. He's going to continue to spend money for the Mets.
Sure.
For me, if you're a guy that's willing to spend money and take risks, which they're essentially doing, I mean, giving a close of the biggest contract ever, giving someone like Brandon Nimmo 8 years. You could even say Verlander, giving him the amount of guaranteed money at his age. I mean, he's already taking risk, and that's tied to injuries.
Right.
I just think essentially what the Mets did is lowball. I mean,
that
would be my feeling. What they did is cut the deal in half. They cut it in guaranteed money, and maybe it doesn't bite them in the end with Boris, but this is now 2 times that they've had an issue with Boris going back to Kumar Rocker. And ultimately, I think Scott Boras is the type of agent, whether people like him or hate him, is out to do the best for his players. So maybe it doesn't affect any negotiations, but it's certainly not a good ploy or a good sentiment to send to offer him that much and be that much less than a franchise like the Twins. I do think there's a little bit of that looks bad to me personally to see that from Cohen and the Mets. And I do think unless there's just something that is just really bad with the ankle and immediate, to not at least match 200 just feel it doesn't seem right after the Mets were already in agreement with Correa. And to get back onto that real quick, I mean, I don't know if this is going to happen or not. But the Mets are absolutely, Cohen has absolutely lined the Mets up for a grievance. I mean,
1,000%.
and
Absolutely.
and there's no like there's the Mets would lose the grievance.
Right.
It's in the New York Post.
Yep.
And I know some people, and I've mentioned it before, like, well, Carlos Correa is injured, and that's why it doesn't matter.
Right.
The fact that there actually is an ankle issue there and that there's a doctor issue there, that has no relevance to a grievance whatsoever.
Right.
Ken Rosenthal talked about one today with, I can't remember who it was. I think it was the Orioles, and Xavier Hernandez was the player's name. And they backed out of the deal after someone not smart, again, had mentioned it publicly in their front office. And it turned out that there was a medical issue.
Right.
And he signed for much less because the medical issue got out there because of the agreement and it not signing. And he filed a grievance. He won. And it was essentially the difference in between what he was going to sign with the Orioles and what he did end up signing with a different team. So again, the fact that there is an actual reason or logical explanation for backing out of said deal, it doesn't matter in terms of a grievance.
Right.
If Carlos Correa wants to file a grievance for the difference in the guaranteed money, that's absolutely within his, that's what he can do. I'm not so sure, again, that that's what they want to do, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Sure. I think, just to piggyback that off real quick, I wonder if, for the sake of the relationship between Boris and the Mets, that they won't file a grievance. Because, obviously it'd be Correa's camp that does it, whatever. But I just wonder, for the sake of that, Boris thinking of his other clients and long term, you want to keep that relationship open. I wonder if they would do it. But he's absolutely has aligned himself up for a grievance. We talked about that the last couple of weeks. And like I said, it's, part of these growing pains, and you could have all the money in the world, but you still have to learn how to know the team. He's learning that, and I can pretty much almost guarantee he'll probably never do that again until the deal is finalized. He will never speak of anything until pen is to paper and there's a press conference or whatever, because, like you said, that can become a costly mistake.
I mean, let's just, since we're talking about it, let's just say that Correa does file the grievance and he does win for, the difference is right around $112 million guaranteed. Mm-hmm. Say he wins for somewhere around there. That means the Mets risk that they could have taken at 620 looks a lot better than the risk that they're taking of getting a grievance.
Right.
So that's, again, we just don't, this is just us chatting about it at this point. But the reality is that Correa can file a grievance and that they would have a very good case.
It's there's nothing to really even reference, like to go back to other, free agency. Like this is a case of its own.
Just to have it spread out over so many days and to have so many teams involved. And it sounds like this last time there was actually a couple more teams that had at least called because, they smelt blood in the water. This is the second team that hadn't gone through. How cheap can we get a player?
Right.
Because let's face it, we're still talking about Carlos Correa. He's still a star player. So how cheap can we get a player like this? And I'm sure the Red Sox, after finding out about Trevor's story, they probably tried to get in late on the whole Correa thing. So, there's certainly, it sounded like there was at least 4 or 5 other teams that were kind of in the mix to see if they could get him on maybe even like a deal like they did last year.
Right.
I think it was good for Correa that he ended up in that situation last year because it seems like he made a good home with Minnesota and they were there waiting in open arms. And from what their front office said today, they had kind of been in touch with Boris throughout this entire process and just keeping a pulse on everything and seeing what was going to happen. And also, while we're talking about the press conference, I don't know if all the listeners have seen it, but Boris did not hold back. He was kind of, he was Boris, Scott Boris, and he was definitely going at the Giants and Mets medical teams, talking about how MRIs aren't important and how you need to be in close proximity with the player day to day. And It was, I mean, if you want to go in twins.com, they have it there and watch. It's comical to watch Boris kind of go through this stuff at least. But yeah, I think, I mean, to kind of put a bow on the whole Correa thing, because I think at this point, sad, mad, happy, whatever you are about this situation, I think Mets fans ultimately would just kind of like to put a bow on this now and kind of move on and kind of figure out what the team's going to do next. I mean, pitchers and catchers are next month. Games not too far after that, and ultimately the Mets have had it. It seems bizarre to like kind of look at it now, but the Mets had a really good offseason until Correa. I mean, Correa made it like next level offseason, but now, I mean, this kind of takes a little bit of a step back because they do need a piece. Cohen said they need a piece. It's not wrong. I mean, they still need a bullpen piece. And they got to find a way to round out this roster. So, I mean, that's kind of the next couple of weeks is what can the Mets salvage from the rest of what has been a good offseason.
Yeah, it's been a great offseason for the Mets. And to your point, though, right, someone like Correa put them over the top because for as good as the offseason the Mets had, you know, you can argue the Phillies did more. The Phillies are a better team right now. The Braves are the Braves. You know, I don't – now, listen, this year's going to be a balanced schedule, right? It's going to be different. You're not playing your division 19 times a year. Everybody's playing the same balanced schedule, right? And, you know, again, six teams a league make the playoffs. I look at the Phillies from this past year now. I don't think the Mets need to win 100+ games and you know drag their way to the division like they did last year. I think ultimately that division race tired them the hell out, and they were running on its fumes essentially. Now losing Marte for a month didn't help, whatever, but I think they ran on fumes. That division race really took a lot out of them. I think Philly and Atlanta are still just maybe just above better if you look at their rosters and things like that. But all I care about at this point is getting in the tournament. I don't care. Get in the playoffs and be hot at the right time. The Mets have players, right? It's an older roster, but you get these guys humming on the right cup in September, and they go in, they win 80, 89, 90 games and make the wild card, but they're hot at the right time. I'll much rather that than a team that won the division then stagger through, and then you just kind of get, beat over the head because you're coming in, cold. But
well, and one thing to kind of add to that, I think,
sure.
I mean, there's a pretty good assumption that the Mets are going to be in it at the deadline.
Yep.
I don't think Cohen is going to want to sit back like he did last year.
No.
There's no possible way in my mind that he could repeat of last year of where they kind of just put in a couple of spots, filled a couple of small spots. Sure. I think if the Mets are in it this year, like we all think they will, yep. I think they're going to make a splash. I mean, specifically now that they didn't Correa, like Correa was that splash.
Right.
Maybe, I mean, you had a really good team once you had Correa. So yeah. I think that even enhances the possibility, assuming they don't make a big trade before the season, enhances the possibility of some blockbuster at the deadline. Sure. I know we mentioned Ohtani. It doesn't seem like they're going to trade him before the year, but he's definitely got to be available at midseason. It just wouldn't make any sense for the Angels to keep holding on to him forever. So someone like Ohtani likely going to be available then, or other pieces that are going to possibly be available. But I think the Mets will be more aggressive at the deadline this year for sure.
You got to hope, because that's what bit them last year. And I thought it was the lack of getting a bullpen on that would hurt them. And it was the lack of a power bat at the end that's what, really did them in. But, Ohtani my thing with Ohtani, I really think he's going to be signed in the offseason as a free agent. I think that Cohen is going to throw this man an obscene amount of money, barring some injury or anything like that this year. I think he's going to be a Met next year. So then put your GM hat on. Do you want to then totally deplete your farm system, which is what that's going to cost for him, to then sign him in the offseason? Or do you say, let's take a step back, let's reassess some other players at the deadline and not give up prospects for a guy that we're going to look to sign long-term in the offseason? Listen, come trade deadline, it all depends what teams are out of it, what's not, right? People become available that normally wouldn't be. So we'll have to remain and see there. But I would think at this point, you sign up, and again, not the level of Correa, we know that, but those rounded off pieces of Profar a Duvall, a McCutchen. Maybe you're signing Andrew Chafin to round out the bullpen. And you roll with Baty and Alvarez. You let your young guys now, for the most part, take that step and see what they have. And I think you reassess at the deadline. I think that's, kind of what they're going to have to do. And this is still, listen, we know this Correa put them over the top. We understand all that. Still a very good roster. Very, very good roster. They, retained about 85% of this core, 80% of the core that they have. And the guys that left, they replaced with great players. So, it's a curious thing. I'm wondering what you think about a guy like Bryan Reynolds. I don't know if I'm trading the house for him, for what the asking price seems to be from the Pirates, but I'm just a little curious about what do you think about a guy like that?
I think, well, I personally like Bryan Reynolds a lot. I mean, if you go look at his offensive numbers and his production's right below Correa, so same type of offensive output there. I think that what gives you pause is that the reported asking price is just sky high right now.
Right.
From when I talk to people, I mean, you're like talking Alvarez and another piece, and I just don't think that the Mets are going to do that. I know Reynolds is very good. You would slide in the left field. You get multiple years of control of him, but there's other teams involved too. I mean, the Yankees have been on this for a while. Sure. The Texas Rangers are all in this too. They would love to get him, and they have some big pitching pieces that they could move that the Pirates would love to get. So I would I think it would be a great upgrade for the Mets. Right now, I haven't heard anything that would suggest that it's likely or even that it could happen. I mean, I definitely think the Mets have. I mean, I know the Mets have called the Pirates and talked to him about Reynolds. I mean, it only makes sense. He's on the market and the Mets need a bat. So, I think there's other teams essentially ahead of them that would have packages that they're willing to give up better than him if it comes to it. But right now, it just sounds like the price is so crazy high, which at some point is got to come down because the Pirates just aren't going to pay Reynolds. I mean, they gave him some crazy offer of like $75 million, which is, I mean, it's not going to happen. He's past those years. He's like 2 years past getting that type of deal. He's not at the point in their career like the Braves locked up their players. He is past that. He's had 3 good major league years. So offering him that type of years, they essentially offered him about half of what you could even look at giving him on the market right now. So, but yeah, and past Reynolds, I mean, you could speculate about a lot of guys potentially, but it doesn't seem like there's really anyone else on the market trade wise. And let's face it, we're in January. I mean, how many teams are trading a big bat in January going into February? Just doesn't happen a lot. I mean, I think Cohen and Epler are going to push. I mean, they're going to push teams. They're going to talk to teams, and they're going to push teams and see what's available. I definitely think they're going to do that because we've talked about, I mean, Adam Duvall's, I think Adam Duvall's a really nice piece, and he's probably the best fit of all of those for the Mets. He's got good pop, hits lefties well, can play all 3 outfield positions pretty well. And the Mets just have no outfield depth. So they're going to sign someone for the outfield. And I think Duvall's the best of that group. I think from people I've talked to, he's kind of looking for more playing time. So it might be a position where the Mets would have to pay him a little more to get him to New York, where he's just simply not going to play as much as he would other places. I mean, even after a down year, there's probably teams willing to give him a starting role or at least a more prominent role than the Mets would. And then I think that's pretty much the same case with Profar. I mean, he had a really good year last year, a 3-win season. So I think teams are going to see him as a starter. And honestly, from a Mets standpoint, I think he's not as good as a fit as Duvall. He's kind of outside of last year. He really hasn't been very good in his major league career. He hasn't shown much power in his career. I just don't. I think he's the type of guy that ends up getting overpaid for having a good year. And again, he's another guy that's going to look to cash in on that. So I know Andrew McCutchen was a name that was mentioned today. And outside of Duvall, I do think he is a good fit. I mean, obviously he's on the downside of his career, but he's still a guy that hits lefties really well.
Right.
He can play the outfield reasonably well.
Mhm.
He can stand out there. He's still fairly athletic.
Yep.
And let's face it, if you're talking about like clubhouse guys in baseball,
Right.
I'm
Right.
not sure he is the ultimate good vibes guy, right?
Sure.
Like
Sure.
he's the ultimate clubhouse guy.
Yeah.
Never hurts to have a guy like him and a leader like him around. So yeah, I think he's a really good fit as a fourth outfielder too. So if they aren't able to get Duvall to kind of buy into being the fourth outfielder, I think Cutchin's a really good option. I know Trey Mancini's another guy we've talked about. The Mets are kind of looking for someone that's more of an actual outfielder than Mancini is. So I'm not sure he's a great fit. Obviously, he played for Buck, so I'm sure Buck would be happy to have him, and he'd obviously be an upgrade on Darren Ruff. But I mean, outside of these guys, those four guys, then it just gets lower in terms of, I mean, talking like Lorenzo Cain, Chad Pinder, Jackie Bradley Jr. I mean, we're getting far down the list of guys that aren't particularly useful at this point in their careers. So I think you have to kind of get one of Profar, Duvall, Kutch, or Mancini. I think you have to at this point, assuming that they don't make a trade, because they need that outfield depth, and the bench needs to be better. I mean, you want to replace Darren Ruff. You really don't want to have him on the roster for next year.
Yeah, I'm sure the Mets would like to, either take that trade back or hope that he could bounce back, but I don't know if they can, risk that. I'm sure if they do look to trade him at this point, he had last year before he got to the Mets, like a 900 OPS against lefties. Someone will take him. I would think it's not going to be for a lot, but someone will take a chance if they want to go that route. I don't know if they want to call it a wash just yet after they just, did it last year. But we'll see. I mean, as far as if I had a choice between the guys that you're talking about that's available, to me would be Duvall or McCutchen. I like Duvall the most out of all those guys, only just because of the power standpoint. Obviously, he had a down year last year, but the guy we know can be a 30-plus homer dude, at times. The Mets are lacking pop in that lineup, and I think someone like that would be a nice upgrade. Extend the bench a little bit as far as you're talking about. I don't love Profar. I like Profar's positional flexibility. They can play in the outfield and the infield, but he doesn't have a lot of pop. The Mets don't need that. And McCutchen, I think you tweeted out today, Kutch's numbers against lefties. It's more than serviceable. It's still got some pop against lefties. And like you said, the clubhouse presence would be huge. But ultimately, I think, like you said, if they can overpay a little bit for a guy like Duvall, I think it could pay off dividends for them, because I think that's a power bat off the bench, fourth outfielder, guy you can slot into DH. That would, I think really go a long way now that they lost out on Correa.
Yeah, and I think beyond that, like you kind of mentioned with Andrew Chafin, it's come out that they have interest in Zach Britton. Matt Moore is still out there. Will Smith is still out there. There's a couple other lefties still out there. I think they still have to add at least one bullpen piece too. Michael Fulmer still out there, former Met.
Bring him home.
Yeah, there's some decent bullpen options still out there. I remember this time last year, Adam Ottavino was still a free agent, and he turned out to be the Mets setup guy, and one of the best free agent signings of the offseason. So, there's still some viable pieces out there, and I think the Mets kind of want to shore up some of that, some of the questions in the back end of their bullpen. I think they've done a really good job of getting optionable depth.
Yeah,
whether it was trades with Miami, claims. Rule 5. I think they've done a really good job creating some depth, and obviously they got David Robertson, the trade for Brooks Raley, and bringing Diaz back. So I think they have a good nucleus of the bullpen, and like I said, I think it's fairly deep. But I do think you want to add potentially another lefty there, and just overall another bullpen piece that you can count on. So between kind of rounding out, like we're talking about, just kind of rounding out the roster at this point, outside of some big trade that we don't see right now.
Right.
I think that's kind of the way they're looking. So you get a backup outfielder, and then you get a bullpen arm, and then you get ready for pitchers and catchers. And like you said, I mean, I know it was kind of seen as a bad thing when the offseason started, when they were talking about, hey, bringing this player back, well, you're just bringing back the same players. Well, yeah, it's the same team that won 101 games.
Right.
Like, bringing back the same players from a 101 win team isn't a bad thing.
Right.
That's a very good thing, because that means you had a very good team. I mean, a wild card round, a best of 5 is just a crapshoot. That's just what it is.
Yep.
Unfortunately, the Mets got some bad pitching performances, and they just didn't have any
outslugged by Trent Grisham.
So, I mean, it just happens. Yeah, like you said, they essentially got beat by Trent Grisham, which is the oddity of a 5-game series. Like you said, get the best team you can possibly going into the year, improve at the deadline, and then hope that everyone puts it together at the right time. The Mets have a good team right now. I think that's probably the biggest thing you can kind of land on after this whole Correa saga is, look, the Mets are still very good. We know that the owner is willing to spend, which makes, like we've talked about, look, you don't want to look past this year, because obviously the Mets have high hopes for this year. But let's face it, the superstars of superstars is going to be available in Shohei Ohtani. And Manny Machado might be available too if he opts out. So there's going to be ways that Steve Cohen can spend his money coming up. And there's going to be superstars available. So, and now we know that Cohen's willing to do it. I mean, the first couple of years he certainly spent, and they did some things, but this offseason he really showed that I don't give a shit. I don't care, and I don't care what the other owners think. I'm just going to spend the money to win. And that's, even though it didn't go through, that's what the Correa thing really showed. It showed that he's willing to do essentially whatever it takes to make sure that the Mets are winner. And I think that's another one of the ultimate takeaways for the long-term future of the Mets. That's obviously a very good sign. And speaking of long-term future, I think that's kind of a good segue into, you kind of mentioned it, this changes things now for one player in particular, Brett Baty. I mean, he essentially, with the signing of Correa, went ultimately and quickly into a position change. I mean, he was going to be a left fielder, which in the minor leagues, I've watched him play left field. He wasn't bad out there. I mean, he runs pretty good for that size guy. He's fairly athletic, makes good side-to-side moves. But now, I mean, he's back to being the Mets' third baseman of the future. The Mets have Escobar guaranteed for this year and an option for next year. But it'll be interesting to see what Baty does in spring training now. I mean, obviously, he was most likely going to be playing a lot of outfield, and now the Mets have to kind of decide what they're going to do with him, because you do have Escobar there, but Escobar had a really uneven first season with the Mets. Pretty bad, honestly, for most of the year. And then just at the end of the year, I mean, he carried the Mets offense when Marte went down. Let's face it, he was one of the best offensive players in the National League the last month or so of the year. So what type of Escobar are the Mets going to get? So going into spring training, what do they want to do? Do they want to play Baty a lot at third and to see if he's going to beat out Escobar and kind of turn Escobar into that versatile utility guy? I know it certainly makes the bench really deep if Baty does do that. I mean, the Mets aren't going to do this just because Baty is a top prospect. Baty would have to beat him out. And I think some folks are down on Baty a little bit from what they saw. And I think most of it, from my point of view, is actually encouraging from Baty. He showed some pop. He hit the ball
real
hard, consistently. The swing looked good. His decisions at the plate looked good. I know some of the defense, there was some issues, but I mean, he's a young guy that had
Run
9
into a pennant
games in
race.
AAA and got thrown
Right.
into a pennant race. Unless he's an elite defender, I think you're going to see some issues on the defense.
Right.
I think ultimately he's not going to win any Gold Gloves at third base, but he's also not going to be JD Davis at third base. I think he's kind of a guy that's just going to quietly be decent at third base.
Sure.
And that's certainly not a bad thing for a guy that you think's going to have like a 120, 125 weighted runs created plus. I mean,
Take that.
yeah, I mean, that's a 3-4 win player.
Right.
I mean, that's a really good thing to come from within your own organization, specifically when the Mets have really kind of searched for that third baseman of the future since David Wright got hurt. So I think this, out of everyone, this really gives Baty that shot to kind of prove at some point. Maybe it's not in spring training this year. Maybe it's not in April this year. But at some point, it gives Brady the shot to show the Mets that he is the third baseman of the future.
Sure. And for the outfield, quick thought. There was a former Mets manager yesterday. I don't know if you saw on a certain show for a certain team's channel that said the Mets should maybe try and give a certain Yoenis Cespedes another chance. I love that manager very much. He was great, but I'm going to say I have to disagree with bringing, what is he, 45 at this point, Cespedes? 46? I don't even know.
So just since Collins brought it up, I wasn't even going to tweet about it since Cespedes has kind of fallen off the map. He had the one really good game in Winter League and then kind of fall off the map. So I didn't tweet about it. So, but the update with Cespedes is that he's hurt right now. He has an ankle. He has a leg injury right now.
Shocking. Never heard of that before.
So So I don't think Cespedes came back for like a game or two and got hurt again. So I think that's pretty much gonna toast it for Cespedes. Him playing well in the Winter League was really kind of his last hurrah here. And honestly, he didn't play well. I mean, his OPS was under like 600. And now that he's out with an injury of the leg variety again, I don't see any major league team giving him even a minor league deal at this point. So hey, it was fun when we had him, when he was healthy.
Sure.
The Mets haven't that span that he had in 2015 and in 2016. Honestly, I mean, that's as good a stretch as most players have. I mean, very few players have had with the Mets in that stretch of like a year. And it was fun to watch. I mean, he electrified Mets fans between the home runs, the flashy garb that he always had on, the throws from the outfield, the miscues in the outfield that went into the big throws. I mean, I know some fans are different, but I'll always see Cespedes as kind of, I see the positives of what he did for the Mets, because let's face it, in 2015, they don't get to the World Series without him.
Absolutely. No, let's nip this in the bud. The Mets are older as they are of a team. Don't need to add him there, especially with his 100th lower leg injury. I appreciate the thought from Terry, thinking of his guy as a manager. I get that. But I mean, they don't get to the playoffs in 15. That's probably one of the greatest trade deadline acquisitions ever. And like you said, he was a beast in 2016 also. Did some quirky stuff. Went missing in 2020 for a little while there. Kind of capped everything off. But, it was a good tenure for him with the Mets overall. They won for the most part when he was there. And listen, I say it all the time. Stanley Alston was damned if he did, damned if he didn't. If they didn't re-sign him, the fan base would have went nuts. They did re-sign him, didn't work out. That's what happens with guys like that. Older free agents at times with, an injury past or whatever. And he was always a guy that, played well in contract years when he was looking for a new deal. But, just something that I saw that was funny. I don't know how that could be a serious thought, but, I guess got to fill content.
Kind of tie this in and to go back into Correa, and like we were talking about, like how the Mets, some people would see as they're avoiding some risk and stuff. I think ultimately the only way we're ever going to know if the Mets made the right decision is to look at this thing in 6 years.
Right. Absolutely.
Like you said, the Mets made the decision they had to make at the time with Cespedes. The Mets made the decision they thought they had made now with Correa, and the Twins on their side made the decision they thought they had to make. So I think ultimately to kind of know really at what this is going to turn out to is come back to it in 6 years.
Yep.
Did Correa have a really good 6 years, and did he end up being worth that money? I think that's the really – I mean, we can go back and forth about this for hours and right thing, wrong thing. And I think ultimately the process they got to it and everything they did, the proof is going to be in the pudding with this one. Is his ankle going to hold up for the next 6 years? And that's really the only way we're going to know if the Mets made the right decision or not. Because let's face it, if he's healthy for the next 6 years, then the Mets made the wrong decision. I mean, they simply did, because this is a player that they wanted. And if Correa ankle falls apart in 2 years, like some doctors seem to think it will be, then yeah, I mean, the doctors, the lawyers, Cohen, Epler, and all of them made the right decision. So, I mean, we'll circle back in 2029, and after the Mets have won a couple of World Series with Shohei Ohtani, and then we can be like, well, it didn't really matter that Correa ended up being healthy.
Crossed. And I think no matter what, though, whether it turned out to be a mistake or not, the Mets are in a position where they will pivot and still do other things to make themselves successful. You know what I mean? It's like, it's annoying now. We don't know what's going to happen. It could be horrible, like you said, for the Twins. Could have been the wrong decision for the Mets. Could have a great next 6 years, but they're not going to sit on their hands. Like we're talking about, maybe Ohtani, Machado, whatever it is. They're going to do whatever they can to stay competitive and to get the best players possible. So
yeah, and
I think work out this year, but doesn't mean for next few years that they won't do that.
And I think that's why the Mets are in a much better position than the Giants.
Sure.
The Giants struck out on Judge. They struck out on Correa, and somehow their consolation prize was Michael Conforto.
Yes.
But they don't have the deep pockets that Cohen has. So they kind of can't make up for if that is a mistake or whatever. So they just don't have the same leeway. That the Mets do. So, yeah, I mean, in the end, that what we've talked about, that's kind of the positive takeaway is that the Mets are still a very good team, and Steve Cohen is still willing to spend buckets and buckets and buckets of money to make sure that the Mets are good. And you have to think that in the long term that's going to pay out.
Sure. And my last 2 points for the week, Mike, I saw that the Rangers signed Nathan Eovaldi to add to their rotation. Well, the Rangers going to be good. Am I going to be annoyed this year? Are they going to be good? Because I don't want that. I said I'm over it, but like I'm banking on the fact that like they're going to be 20 games under 500, but like their pitching staff is pretty good and they got some dudes, and I don't like that. I don't like that they like built something all of a sudden. It wasn't what it was supposed to be. The jokes aren't working now. I don't like that.
And I think their infield's pretty good too. I think Corey Seager, I mean, a lot of people have talked about it. He's going to be one of the guys that gets a boost from the lack of shift. I mean, Marcus Semien had a really good second half. Jung at third base, long-term for them. I mean, I think that's a pretty solid team. It's a tough division outside of the Angels because the Angels are still not particularly good, though. I mean, you could certainly argue that the Angels added this offseason too. So, no, I think the Rangers are going to be a pretty good team. I mean, I wouldn't be shocked if they're one of those teams that are fighting for one of the extra wild cards. Who knows? I mean, thinking about it now, those teams that improved in the West, and the AL East is still very, very good. I think the Orioles get better just by being a year older. The Yankees, they got Judge back, so I mean that was the big concern with them. The Blue Jays, again, they're just going to be good again. They added Bassett and some other pitching options.
Tampa's Tampa. They're always good.
Tampa's Tampa. Like so
between those another year under their belts. Yeah, no.
Between those two divisions, you have some really good teams. And let's face it, I think the Twins have had a fairly decent offseason too.
Yeah, Gallo, Christian Vasquez, right?
And And there's talks out there that they have been involved in conversations with Pablo Lopez from the Marlins too. So, I mean, I think the American League, which the Mets will see because of, like you talked with the balanced schedule, I think the American League is going to be very good this year.
Yeah. No, definitely. NL East is still the NL East. You got the top 3 teams there. That'll be one of the top 3 divisions in baseball. But I feel like people are more frustrated too, as far as that the Mets are finally in position to contend every year. And then like the NL East is good. The Phillies are good. The Braves are good. Like they like you can't, the timing's never right. But you know what? Makes it sweeter when you win against good teams like that, right? It makes it even sweeter. So hopefully they can just they can get something going. Like I said, I don't care. Don't win. I don't need you to win 100 games. Don't win 100 games and fizzle out. Win 89 games and get hot at the right time and make a run. Totally fine with that. But I guess one last point I did want to make, not to end on a somber note. Obviously, we talked about Liam Hendricks the last couple of weeks as a potential trade target. Fortunately, came out news that he was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and he's about to take his chemo and all that to fight it. So just wanted to wish Liam, all our thoughts and prayers, and hopefully he comes back, even better, because he's a great guy in the game, great pitcher, great closer. So game's better off when he's around. So hopefully, everything works out for him. All the best to him and his family, dealing with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like you said, not beyond just being a great player, he's also a great person. He's done a lot for the community.
Sure.
He's just a good person overall. So we obviously hope the best for him. And maybe he'll snap back and the Mets can trade for him once he's fully healthy and everything. And hopefully we just see him back pitching again.
Right, exactly. Hopefully see him back on the mound healthy. Good stuff there. That'll put a bow on everything this week. We'll catch up with you next week on all the latest. Obviously, there'll be no more Correa talks. We got a bow on that. That saga's over, but still plenty more that the Mets can do here now to round out their roster, and we'll keep you updated with everything. But until then, let's go Mets.